Hi, welcome to this week's episode of the Jim and Shelby Show, the All Things Print Podcast. I'm Jim Raffle.
And I'm Shelby Sapusik. How are you today, Jim?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
Not bad. Glad to be back in North Carolina after visiting the cold North or Midwest where you are.
Yeah, I've got snow outside.
Yeah, not so much down here.
All right, so today I think we want to talk a little bit about spot colors, right?
Yes, that's what we were working on this week.
We were, right? We were working with a customer here in the cold Midwest, and we've been working with them for a while on a spot color optimization program. And so that got us both talking and thinking about spot colors and reminded us that we are doing a presentation on spot colors at the Digital Textile Conference in Durham, actually, I think it is. December 7th, I believe, is the date that we'll be speaking, December 7th or 8th. And so I started thinking about what the spot color journey looks like. And for most people, I think it starts with printing a color or having something delivered to them by a customer, right? They might bring them this green tape measure and say, we need to print this green tape measure. And what a lot of people will do is they'll grab a guidebook like the Pantone book, and they'll try and find a green in the guidebook that matches the item that they're supposed to be printing. And that to me is the way that the spot color journey begins for a lot of people, at least in the space I come from, which is printing. Now, your background is more design. So do you have a similar experience or a different experience?
As far as I don't
Well,
know what you're asking.
So the source of a spot color, right? The source. So, in printing, a lot of times, literally, you're brought a physical object and you're asked to print this to match this color when you print it, right?
Most
So,
often we're brought like what we call chips or swatches. Yes.
okay, because I know in newspaper, I remember you telling some stories that you would have to do trade-offs between the ad on the back page and your company, your newspaper banner on the front page, right? Because those would run in line with each other, right?
On the same form, yes. On a printing press, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so the next thing that I've seen happen in printing companies is that they go from physical evaluation with a guidebook to some kind of measuring colors, right? So you print something that has a brand color on it, and then you grab a device like now the modern little Nixes. We can use this with some software on an iPhone and actually measure a color and find out what the LEV values are of that color, or depending on the software you're using, is it a Pantone color or is it matching the spot color it's supposed to measure? You can do the same thing with a bunch of different devices. X-Rite has some, the X-Rite Exact has a Pantone library built in. I'm sure there's probably tools that you can use like an i1 with and take a measurement and find out whether or not it's matching a Pantone or matching your given spot color. And so we go from just trusting our eyes to verifying what our eyes are seeing with numeric data, but that assumes something, right? That assumes that we know what the digital value of the color is, right? So that comes back to the design world. And hasn't something happened recently in the Adobe space?
Well, sure. Now, actually, it hasn't happened yet.
Oh, really? So it
No,
still hasn't happened? Wow.
no, it was supposed to happen back in March. But what we're talking about is Adobe and Pantone announced, or X-Rite, I suppose, announced that the Pantone libraries were no longer going to be available in the Adobe software. There were some workarounds that we talked about. In fact, we made a YouTube video, an educational video back in late February, early March, because we expected it to happen soon. And right now, even this week, I was working in Adobe Illustrator. And while the warning came up saying that pretty soon the Pantone libraries weren't going to be available, they certainly still are.
Okay. So that leads me to the question is, what do we do as printers, right? And because that's who I do most of my consulting with, to make sure that we can produce spot colors accurately. And so while I may keep referencing Pantone just because it's convenient and it's easy, it's one that people understand, many people have we have a client actually who has a huge spot color library, none of which are technically Pantones. They are physical swatches that, like you said, chips that came from a customer. They matched that chip in their ink room with their ink vendor, and they've built a humongous database of these colors. And so one
They're
of the
mostly brand colors.
in that case, it is mostly brand colors, right? And so they're very specific. But my point is that it's a library, and it's all based on digital values. In this case, spectral curves, but you could convert those to LAB. And and so the next thing you can do is you can take that library and again put it in something like an iPhone application, and then using a simple handheld device, you can measure your output and see whether or not it's conforming to the specification that was provided by the customer. And that's all well and good. What do we do though if it's not conforming? Or, in the case of Pantone, there's 2,140 some colors now, right? And this is all of them printed in very small patches. And the reason we did that is that, to me, the next step is to print them all. And so I'll hold up one page here at a time, to print them all in one page, and then use an instrument, in our case like the i1. We can measure all of those, and if we have access,
actually, right?
pardon
Didn't
me?
we use the mix?
We could do it with the Nix. Yes, you could do it with the Nix. I'm just mentioning this is an I1 measurable version.
Was it? Okay.
You could easily do it with the Nix. Yep. You can do it with any instrument. And so to me, the next logical step though is you measure every color in your library, whether it's Pantone or your own private library. And when I say you measure it, you print. So you take the digital values, and whatever your printing method is, you convert the digital and you print them, and then you measure the printed and you compare it back to the digital, and you'll get a delta E difference. And then you can sort that. You can take that 2,000 color list and you can sort it by delta E, and you can decide that anything more than 3.5 is too much and we don't want to print that. And so you basically then let your customers know, or internally, that anything more than 3.5 delta E, we can't print and we don't want to print. And so when people ask for those colors, you say, we can't print that color, right? And so what you're doing is you're preventing problems before they become problems and rejected orders. And that's cool too. That's a great step.
There's a caveat to that, though. Even this week, we were finding that there were colors that would fall within 1 or 2 delta E of a difference between the Pantone and the print. And visually, those colors were not acceptable. So I don't want people to take away from this that you should solely rely on a measurement, because we definitely needed our eyes when we were working with our client this week.
Right. It's a combination. The instruments always offer your eye an assist, not the other way around. But the other thing an instrument does is it can evaluate a large number of colors very, very quickly. And you're right. And then it should, based on the results there, you do need to go back through and look at everything once you've processed it. And so what we figured out over the last year or so working with a couple clients is that once I measure all 2,000 Pantones or whatever color family it is, whatever library it is, we can reprocess the data. So in other words, we have a color, and compared to its digital standard, it's too much. It's 3.5, 3.75 delta E. That's too much. But we have these other 2,000 colors we can compare it to. And oftentimes we'll find one in that 2,000 color library that says, oh, it's only 1.5 away from this. And so what we then do is we create a spreadsheet or a document that says, when you see color 101, you actually want to use color 110 because it's a better match. And that's still a very manual system. Well, it's automated to create it, but it's a manual process then of saying, what do we do? How do we make sure that everything that is tagged 101 on a file becomes 110? And do we do that in design, or do we do that in the RIP? And so those become, the next level of decisions. But now you're at a point of what I call optimization. So instead of just saying, hey, we can't print 101 because my default 101 was delta E was 3.75, that's too much. But I found another color in this big printout I did based on my measurements that was closer. And this is where Shelby's caveat came in, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to process the whole library that way. And then we're going to produce a swatch book. And Shelby, I think that we're going to have Jacob share a picture here.
I took a picture of the one we used this week. Yes.
Actually. Okay, excellent. So we'll pop that up so you can see it. And then what we suggest doing is visually evaluating that swatch book against whatever your reference is. And in the case of Pantone, it's fairly easy. Now, remember, this is only a guidebook. The actual digital values are, in fact, more accurate, but I can't visually evaluate against digital values. I have to visually evaluate against something that's printed or physical. And so that's where our client in question actually went through every color one at a time and compared the swatch in the book to the swatch that printed. And Shelby's right. Some of them that had very low delta E's when measured, when we visually looked at them, it's like, no way, this is not good enough. It needs some work. And so instrumentation, like our eyes, is not always perfect. It's consistent. It's just not perfect. It's not going to always match up with our eyes. But the nice thing about that is that once we have evaluated the entire library a couple times, both digitally or numerically with spectrophotometers, and then with our eyes, and we've gone into our RIP software and actually made adjustments, because that's the cool thing about RIP software. Now we're going from a manual spreadsheet that we have to look at and go, oh, make this replacement, to no, we actually go into the RIP software and say, hey, whenever you see color 101, automatically replace it with 110. And now we don't have to modify customers' artwork. Now all we have to do is know, the 18 or 20% or 10% of the colors in my library that we just literally can't produce correctly. And those we can flag different ways in an automated workflow. But other colors, they're just going to come through. The RIP is going to go, oh, you're color 101, you're printing on this printer A. We know that we've created a library for printer A that color 101 is actually 110. And this sounds like a lot, and it is a lot of work to get it set up. But the cool thing is once it's all set up, it's a black box to the end user, because the designer who's designing this, your customer, doesn't have to think about it. Your own in-house doesn't have to think about it, as long as it goes through some kind of pre-flight software, and the pre-flight software says, nope, there's no colors in here that are problem colors. These are all okay colors based on the printer we're sending it to. We send it to that printer, we produce the output, and we should be, 99.9% of the time happy with the output, unless something else has gone wrong. I don't know. Is that making sense, or did I get too deep in the weeds?
I mean, it makes sense to me because I lived it the last couple of days. Yeah, I all that makes sense to me. There's just a couple things that I would point out too is there are a lot of things that you have to do on the design side to work with spot colors, even just with naming conventions. So we talked a lot about naming conventions for these charts, as well as for the colors themselves. When you're working with spot colors in any software, if you want it to be recognized by the RIP, it needs to be named exactly the same thing from the design software to the RIP. And then I think another good point is many people are unaware of how powerful some RIP software can be when dealing with these spot colors, being able to print out those color books and do comparisons with 2% and 5% away from our original, and going that way, and not really trying to match Pantones, but trying to get, for instance, we were trying to get a good black yesterday. And we went through a process in Caldera, where the Caldera RIP, where we printed out what we thought would be a good rich black for the customer, and yet it wasn't quite what we were looking for. And so we were able to print out basically a bunch of squares of different percentages, starting with the original and spacing it out, adding a little yellow here, a little magenta here, and then we can go back in and visually look at it and also measure. So those capabilities also help us with spot colors, besides of what we were talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thinking about the RIP side of it, you made me start thinking about recipes, right? We happen to be working in CMYK profiles. And so any recipe adjustments were done in CMYK. I was holding up a lot of textile examples. Many dye sub textile shops have gone to RGB profiles. And so people ask me, well, this won't work in an RGB world. I'm like, well, it actually will work exactly the same, except that when you want to create a custom recipe, your custom recipe has to be created in RGB instead of CMYK, which is a little more challenging. If you come from a CMYK world and you're used to doing color adjustments in CMYK, to start doing color adjustments in RGB is a little bit more challenging.
Sure.
For a designer who's worked in the RGB world their whole life, it's actually easier. So it just depends on your background, but the process we talked about of either measuring colors, optimizing colors, all of that is exactly the same. The only thing that would change is, as Shelby said, at the end, if you're trying to dial in a specific color a little bit closer, if you're working in an RGB world, an RGB profile world, then your adjustments have to occur in RGB. If you're in the CMYK world, which is where we happen to be this week, then your adjustments happen in CMYK and your color books happen in CMYK. But that's all fairly easy to do once you know which color space you're working in.
I think this goes back to color theory too. We mentioned RGB and CMYK, but both of those color spaces are device dependent. So you have to think about, you might have different profiles for different printers, that use different substrates, that have different inks. And even though you come up with the right formula for a color on one printer, you may need to tweak it a different way for another printer based on, the variables. I'll mention again that we're going to be speaking at Digital Textile Printing Conference in Durham. You can find that by going to printing.org and go to events, conferences, and then choose Digital Textile Printing. We're speaking on December 7th, but the conference is from December 7th and 8th. And on the evening of December 7th, we're actually sponsors. So I will be there. I know you can't be, Jim, because are you headed to a cruise again, I think? But yeah,
it's been 8-9 months since I went on a cruise.
Yeah, no, okay. Let's see. Last cruise I took was let's not even. But I will have a sponsorship table on December 7th, so come find me.
All right, yeah, I was actually going to. We'll just take a brief pause here, and I will come back with that website displayed so people can see what that looks like. All right, so here is the site for Digital Textile Conference. Again, as Shelby said, it's on the printing.org. And if you go to events and conferences, Digital Textile Printing, this is what you will find. You can register here, so please do. I think it's a great conference. We've actually been there a few years now. All the details. Here's your agenda, right? So there's all kinds of people speaking about color and textiles. We are on day 1 in the morning, right? I think we're around 10 o'clock or something like that, if I remember correctly. Oh, Shelby, it looks like maybe our table will be out there in the morning too. I don't know. We'll have to double check. We learn something new every day.
I don't know if that's true or not.
Okay. All right. But anyway, you can see the list of topics here, and there's a full second day of events. I think it wraps up around lunch on the second day, if I remember correctly. Quite a list of sponsors. So these are all the people who will have tables, and you can stop by and talk to these people. And Shelby will be one of them. All right. I think that's probably it for this week, right?
I think so. I think we could talk about spot colors all day, but it's probably enough for now.
We absolutely could.
We'll save some for our presentation next month. How about that?
We should. That's a really good idea. So come to the Digital Textile Printing Conference to learn more. So, all right. Thanks again for joining us at the Jim and Shelby Show. This has been a fun week, and we will hopefully see you again next week.